Gillian carried the tray of trembling white porcelain between the tables of the busy cafe, heading towards the corner and the only empty seat. Once settled at the formica table, on a small, unnecessarily hard chair, she set out her tea things, poured a cup from the bullet-shaped teapot, and sighed, closing her eyes momentarily. How a cramped little cafe can be such a source of bliss, she thought to herself, and then reached into her bag and took out her paperback, placing it carefully on the table, establishing herself in the corner for a while. As the cafe grew more crowded, the windows fogged with steam from countless conversations, Gillian noticed a smart-looking young man in a suede jacket and jeans at the counter scanning the room for a seat. Aware of the empty chair at her table, she quickly lowered her gaze to her book, pretending to read a page she'd already finished. The ruse did not work. For moments later, the other chairs scraped against the linoleum floor, and a man's voice spoke. "Do you mind if I sit here?" Gillian looked up, her eyes meeting the sharp blue ones of the fair-haired young man who'd been standing at the counter. "No, of course not," she said, closing her book, immediately disarmed by the man's charm and appearance. "It is very busy." "Thank you," said the man as he sat down, finding a small space on the table to put his coffee cup. Gillian smiled an apology. "So much paraphernalia involved with a cup of tea," she blustered, suddenly aware of a warming sensation in her cheeks as she moved her teapot, milk, and sugar to one side. "Should have just had coffee," she laughed. "Oh my God, I'm like some silly schoolgirl. Stop it now, Gillian. Please don't apologize," the man said, running a hand through his hair. Though it was short at the back and sides, it was longer on top, falling into his eyes. "There's a new store opening this morning. I think that's why it's so busy." "Oh, I hadn't heard," Gillian murmured. "I was planning on going to the bookshop on Queen Street. I doubt you'll know it." "Hopkins and Black? Yes, I know it. It's brilliant, isn't it?" Gillian was a little taken aback that the young man would even know of the quirky bookshop, filled with old editions and rare books. A place she loved to escape to whenever she could. "I wouldn't have thought it would be your sort of place," she said. "And why ever not?" said the man, feigning hurt feelings. Gillian stammered, averted her eyes, and took a sip of tea. "I'm just so much older than you," she said. "I'd have thought you'd prefer something more modern, like the big bookstore in the shopping center." "What are you saying, woman? You sound like his grandmother." "Not for me," the man smiled. "I like the older things in life." And he caught Gillian's deep brown eyes for a moment, until she turned away, tucking a dark curl behind her ear, her cheeks flushed. "Anyway, I'm Archie. Might as well introduce myself as we're sharing a table." "Gillian," she said simply with a small smile, summoning the courage to look in Archie's direction. "Would you mind too much just watching my tea things while I pop to the washroom?" she said suddenly, catching herself off guard and questioning why all of a sudden she felt she must check her hair and makeup. "Of course not. I'll mind your book for you too." In the ladies' washroom, Gillian stared at her reflection in the brightly lit mirror. She touched her hair, smoothing it where it frizzed a little, and reapplied her lipstick. Then, unexpectedly, and for no reason that she could immediately admit to, she found herself tugging at her wedding ring, which she then carefully secreted in the inside pocket of her bag. She regarded herself. "What on earth am I doing? I'm 53, not 18. Before she could dwell on it, another woman entered, taking a place at the mirror, and Gillian hurriedly gathered her things together and returned to her table, where Archie sat, sipping his coffee. "Thank you for saving my spot," she said. "Not a problem." Archie put down his now empty cup. "I see you're reading Aikman, a good choice." "Oh, you like him?" I've just read a couple of his short stories. As part of my degree, I love the bizarre and weird stuff that he comes up with. Exactly. I've probably read this book at least 5 times. I just love the ambiguity. The feeling of unease. Jillian ran her fingers over her battered copy of Dark Entries. I don't know why I like that. It's just a great way to escape from real life for a while. It's almost prosaic horror in a way. Archie spoke softly. Thought and feeling had stopped, and they were immortal. The moment was immortal, and a silent interlude hung over the little Formica table. Jillian gasped inwardly. How on earth could he have known that? Archie watched her intently, gauging her reaction. Her self-conscious prickled hot in her face again. Stunned by his words, she dared not ask how he'd known. So, what is it you're studying? She said, briskly changing the subject. English, literature, and philosophy, my final year. Archie grinned, toying with his empty coffee cup. I should really be working on my dissertation this morning, but, well, here I am, talking to you. He put the cup down and glanced at his watch. I hope you don't think it presumptuous of me, but it doesn't look like the person I was meeting is going to show up. So how about I tag along with you to Hopkins and Black? Now what do I do? Why would he want to? What if... Jillian picked up her book, her fingers briefly touching Archie's as he pushed his cup aside. She glanced away, gaining seconds to compose her response. But before she could think of a reason to decline, she found herself saying, I can't think why you'd want to spend any more time with me, honestly. But I would enjoy the company. Don't put yourself down, said Archie, appearing wiser than his years. You strike me as someone who'd be lovely company. He got up from his seat and moved around to pull out Jillian's chair. Now come on, let's go and look at some books. And Jillian found herself leading the way out of the cafe, oblivious to the whispers and turned heads, conscious only of the good-looking young man following closely behind. Hopkins and Black was the sort of bookshop that would not have been out of place in Victorian times, with its darkly painted frontage, and name in flowing gold script above the window. As they entered, Jillian felt immediately at ease, as the familiar scent of musty books, mingled with a faint hint of mildew, welcomed her. The dark old bookshelves and their dusty contents, softening reality, creating a sanctuary where she could become gloriously lost for a while. Jillian felt herself exhale, as though she'd been holding her breath for far too long, and a small smile crept across her lips as she and Archie meandered through the dimly lit avenues of books. Was there anything that you were looking for particularly? Archie asked as they made their way up the wooden staircase to the fiction section. It would be nice to find a really special first edition. Maybe something by Blackwood, Eichmann, or Lovecraft even, said Jillian, surprised at how naturally the words came. With Archie, she could be herself, bookish, eccentric, even. It was so much easier than talking to Mike, her football-obsessed husband of 28 years. Well, you never know, said Archie, jogging up the stairs to her side as they reached the first-floor landing. Perhaps today will be your lucky day. The warmth in his tone made her chest tighten in a way she'd forgotten could be possible. His eyes lingered on hers for a fleeting moment, and Jillian felt a flush returning to her cheeks. She turned away to the nearest shelf, brushing her fingers lightly over the spines of the books, unsure whether she wanted Archie to notice her blushes or not. As Jillian browsed the darkened shelves, a surreal feeling passed over her, as if the dust motes and particles of stale air released from pages of aged books had cast a spell. In the dim corners of Hopkins and Black, she felt oddly alive, as though she were in a film. This isn't real life. But just for this moment, it is, she thought, before turning suddenly, as Archie tapped her gently on the shoulder. Have a look at this, he said, holding out a book of Blackwood stories. It's not a first edition, but it's a nice old copy. For a moment, Jillian stared at him, Words caught in her throat, rocked by the peculiar sensation. This sort of thing doesn't happen to me. It's lovely, she said quietly, taken aback by the young man's thoughtfulness, that he'd listened to her, searched for something he knew she'd like. Thank you, she whispered. And then, compelled by something that had been absent for too long, Gillian put a trembling hand to his cheek, unable to pull it away, and before she had thought any longer, Archie covered her hand with his eyes catching hers in the dim light. Too close, too intense. Gillian's breath caught as she battled with guilt, passion, confusion, and then, as control escaped her, she leaned in. The warmth of his breath on her face, and for a fleeting second, their lips touched. What am I doing? What am I doing? Gillian's mind broke loose, and she jerked back, slamming into the bookshelves behind her. No, I mustn't, she breathed. I'm so sorry, and she fled, stumbling down the stairs and out of the door into the street, where she ran, away from the shop, from Archie, and from herself. Gillian looked at her faint reflection in the train window, the ghost of a woman, who just an hour ago had been sensuous, enthralling, a woman with a new place in the world. You stupid, stupid woman. Gillian wiped her eye with the back of her hand, quashing the tear that threatened her with the truth. You've made a fool of yourself. How could you be so ridiculous? And then remembering, she hastily reached into her bag and pushed the gold band back onto her finger, where it belonged, she thought sadly. At home she fidgeted and mooched, made the evening meal and ate in silence. She stared blankly at the wall while Mike watched television, then welled up with guilt as she looked at him, smiling to himself as he watched one of his favorite shows. He's done nothing wrong. None of this is Mike's fault. The following day, she forced herself into jobs around the house. This is where you belong. This is what you do. Give your head a shake, you silly thing. She chastised herself as she folded the laundry, then administered herself with a proverbial 40 lashes as she relentlessly scrubbed the bathroom. When she'd finished, she refused herself the comfort of reading, something she would normally enjoy in the afternoon, telling herself, "You don't deserve it." As the following days dragged by, mundane and predictable, Gillian continued to punish herself, finding more chores, even Mike remarking at how much she was doing. But by the following week, she could stand it no longer. Unsure whether it was a form of closure she was seeking, or perhaps a chance to revisit the woman she'd momentarily become, Gillian boarded the train into the city, and with carefully styled hair and makeup, wearing her most flattering coat, she retraced her steps. At the cafe, Gillian was relieved to find the corner table free, and she sat, fiddling with her teacup, the familiar Formica, glancing hopefully towards the door. What makes you think he's going to be here again? She asked herself, feeling foolish for returning. Maybe I should go to the bookshop, he might be there. Gillian rationalized, desperately trying to convince herself, though her conflict had her frozen in time, not knowing what to do or where to go. And then, as reality began to set in, and her tea had gone completely cold, her heart lurched as her eyes fell upon the blonde hair and recognizable stance of Archie outside the cafe window. Oh my God, he's here! Gillian began to tremble, unable to control her rising emotion. Everything she'd felt and quashed from the previous week came flooding back, hitting her with the force of a great wave. She took a deep breath, watching the door, a smile ready. And then, there he was, still outside, greeting an auburn-haired young woman. He said something. She laughed and looked up at him. He reached, and holding her face in his hands, kissed her fully on the mouth. Their heads remained close as she tucked her arm comfortably in his, and they started to walk away together. No, no, no! Horror and dismay slapped Gillian forcefully across the face. She grasped the sides of the table, as though she might fall at any moment. Her chest tightened, a sickening sense of reality rising within her. She sat motionless, watching from her lonely place in the corner as the young couple disappeared out of sight. And there she remained with her cold cup of tea until the man from behind the counter came and took it away, and Jillian picked up her bag and left. On the train, Jillian stared out of the window, not seeing the countryside as it sped past, holding on to her resolve to just get home, where she could let the makeup run down her face and allow herself to fall apart. Her mind flipped from one emotion to the next. How could you be so ridiculous to think that someone like Archie would come looking for you? She gulped back a sob. She was so beautiful. Not here, not on the train. Pull yourself together. Act your age. But it was too much, and as the guard checked her ticket and asked if she was okay, her face crumpled, and she pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, sobbing quietly into it until the train reached her stop. The house was quiet, and Jillian was grateful that Mike was still at work. She hung up her coat and entered the living room, where she faced the mirror above the fireplace, reflecting back her swollen eyes and tear-stained face. Better get cleaned up before Mike gets home, you silly, silly girl. And as she turned back towards the room, the sunlight filtering through the net curtains, something on the side table caught her eye. Jillian stepped closer, the familiarity of her living room suddenly feeling alien to her. I even belong here. And then her breath caught as she recognized the book's cover. A hardback Aikman first edition. With trembling hands, she carefully picked it up, as though it might disappear if she touched it. Part of a dream, perhaps, but the book was real. It was a book she'd hoped to find at Hopkins and Black, and it was here, in her living room. She tentatively opened the cover, revealing a piece of paper with a handwritten note, tucked behind the dust jacket. Saw this in town and thought of you. I hope it's the right one. Love, Mike X. Jillian stood motionless as she stared at the note, reading the words again. Her throat tightened, her whole world shook, and as her knees weakened, she lowered herself onto the sofa, clutching the book to her chest. That evening, the book in her lap, Jillian sat on the sofa, her hand resting on Mike's. She felt warm inside as she regarded him, enjoying the television show he was watching. He noticed her looking at him and smiled, nodded, acknowledging how much the book meant to her. He was glad it had made her happy. Then he squeezed her hand and turned his attention back to the television, content in the small world they inhabited together. Jillian slid her hand back across the sofa and turned her attention to the book, a first edition of Dark Entries. She still couldn't believe that Mike had even known it was something she'd like, never mind buy her a copy. She thumbed through the pages, enjoying the weight of the book in her hand, planning to only read this copy now and again to preserve its condition. She was about to close it, to go and make a cup of tea, when she noticed faint markings inside the front cover. Holding it to the light, she could see where a message in pencil had been written and then erased. Must have been a gift to someone else. Once she smiled as she tried to read what the short message said, straining her eyes. In a well-executed hand, she made it out. Thought and feeling had stopped, and they were immortal. The moment was immortal. Eternal. Jillian's breath caught, her hands trembling once more. She glanced across at her husband, happily absorbed in the television. In the dim reflection of its glass, she caught a glimpse of her face, a flicker of someone else, somewhere else, and then it was gone. Her fingers traced the outline of the words, knowing they would only ever be visible to her. Then she closed the book and went to make a cup of tea. I stepped off the bus in the middle of town and got totally soaked by the rain. I tried to shelter myself with the magazine I was reading, but it didn't help much, so I rushed across the busy 5-line street to find an awning. The cars honked at me as I sprinted. Yeah, I know you don't like me, I said to them. I doubt that they could hear me in this downpour, and I really didn't care if they did. I had a really hard day at the office today, as they say. Boss pulled a bunch of us into a conference and started the usual drone about making the numbers, and that we would be all out of job if we didn't make the numbers. I could feel all of the eyes of the room settling on me, as if I had something to do with it. Somebody had to be blamed, I guess, and how was it? All again. I could never catch a break, no matter how hard I tried. The rain really topped of my bad day like the cherry on a banana split. Perfect. I shook my head as I continued to shiver from the rain under the awning of a cafe. "Hey, why don't you come on in and get warm?" a voice said. I turned around and saw a blonde woman in her 30s or so, giving me a smile that could light up a room, and her voice had all the home-style charm of a freshly baked cookie. I followed her into her cafe. As soon as I walked through the door, I felt the rush of warm air and a smell of cinnamon. I saw 2 comfortable chairs and small table in front of a fireplace, so I made a beeline for the closest one and sat down. The chair felt so good. It almost felt like it hugged me. I looked around for a little bit, and then I looked back towards the counter where the barista was making a hot drink. I suddenly felt embarrassed that I had sat down on this chair while still being wet, and my face fell. "I'm so sorry. I got this chair all wet." Again, she smiled at me. "Don't you worry about it, hun. You're all cold and wet and you need something warm in you. Here's a cup of my finest for you on the house." She placed the cup and saucer on the little side table. I saw the steam rising from the hot reddish liquid inside. As much as I tried to resist the urge to wait to take a sip, I felt strangely drawn to this drink as the scent of apples filled my head. "You had a hard day, huh?" "Yeah," I said to her. Then I looked up. "How can you tell?" She laughed. "I'm psychic." She laughed again. "Okay, I'm not psychic. You came in wet and you were looking down at the ground most of the time. It's just body language, that's all. Nothing special." I nodded my head and took a sip of the drink, and it reminded me of a mincemeat pie on Christmas night. I closed my eyes for a bit and just let gravity take me. "It's good, huh?" she said to me softly, almost in a barely perceptible whisper. "I made it just for you, hon." I managed to say before the ambience finally lulled me into a much-needed sleep. "Perhaps a few minutes shut-eye here won't hurt," I said as I reached for the saucer and the cup. Clouds. I saw clouds. I was sitting in a dusty field overlooking the Grand Canyon. It was dusk and the last rays were disappearing over the horizon. The air was crisp and dry. I sighed and yawned deeply as I took in the view. I remember thinking that I should take a little trip here one day. Beautiful, isn't it? "Yeah," I said, then frowned. Who was talking to me? I looked around and I didn't see anyone. Wait. Shh. The female voice intoned softly. "It's totally okay." I continued to look around a bit but saw no one. "Who are you? Where are you?" "Sorry to bother you, but I have news, and you're not going to like it." I looked around again and shook my head. "You have news? I don't even know who you are." The voice sighed for a moment and spoke again more quietly. "Who I am isn't important. I am here to rescue you." "What?" "Let's take a good look at your situation and you'll see why you need me. For starters, you work in the sales department, and your department is not meeting the designated numbers, right?" I slowly nodded. "Well, most corporations by this time have discovered ways to sort of trim the ranks without causing too much fuss and attention." "Okay," I said, wondering where this was going. "So, When the corporation decides to find a sacrificial lamb, they make contact with her and set up a meeting. This way they avoid the termination papers, severance pay, etc. Her? That barista in the cafe. I shook my head at this. Okay, so they send me to a barista or they send her to me. Weird, but so what? I shrugged my shoulders, or at least I thought I did. I suddenly felt a little cramped. Did you notice her name? I think it was Latte or something. Starting to feel a little cramped? That means she has got you, and we don't have much time to get you out. What? Get me out of what? That sounds... Do you trust us? Do I have a choice? What we're about to do has never been tried before. We are going to try matter transference to get you out of there before your whole consciousness disappears. But we have to wait until she has completely wrapped you for storage. My eyes went wide. The voice continued its explanation. That tea gave you has a strong sedative and a narcotic, giving you that euphoria you felt. Then she wraps you up for safekeeping for a while, to keep you fresh. Unfortunately, this process does cause the victim to suffocate. Slowly. Oh, hang on. You're almost totally wrapped up. When she leaves, we'll transport your body out. I tried to speak, but found that could barely get a sound out. I suddenly felt vibrations below me, as if I was on a hammock or a rope bridge or... A web? P. Then, I remembered glancing at the sign before I even walked in, but it just didn't register in my mind until now. It read, Lotta's Parlor, Latro Dectus, the Black Widow Spider. Okay, the voice said again softly. We're almost ready to transport now. You might feel a tingling sensation for a moment. I screamed and screamed and screamed the muffled screams of a condemned man about to be taken to his doom. Then I did feel a slight tingling sensation across my chest. Could I be saved? Epilogue. Morning shined down on the town as the businesses opened up for the day. The barista of Lotta's Parlor was sitting at an outside tables, reading a newspaper and sipping a cup of tea. She sighed. Just the right blend of despair and hope. The sign outside read, Come into Lotta's Parlor. I have just what you need. Ron flicked on the TV. It was almost time for the news. Static fizzed and buzzed behind the crystal screen. The hairs on Ron's neck stood on end. Goosebumps ran down his thighs, his loins tightened. The bees in the tubes of the television's mind were awoken by their queen, dancing to vitalize their still sleeping wings. One by one they fell into line, red bees, yellow bees, blue bees. They swarmed frenetically across the screen, took the form of a tiger, slinking through the jungle with a fresh kill in its mouth. Ron always watched the Flora and Fauna channel before bed. Last night had been a really gripping documentary on monkeys. He liked watching them crawling around, searching for food in a forest of stumps. The narrator called it D4, D-force, demorsphation. Something about paper. Ron liked monkeys, but he liked paper more. Otherwise, what did he have so much of it for? He looked around at the stacks of books strewn around his room. They had belonged to his ex-wife. The only person he missed was his wife, but he never liked her any more than the fellas at work. She couldn't drink beer like they did. The buttons on the remote were made of a soft rubber, skin soft. Pressing them was like pressing against the fatty part of the palm. Ron sometimes held the remote to his face, tried to press all the buttons at the same time. He'd watch whatever channel was summoned by this. In the morning, though, he had purpose. Ron commanded the skin to channel 2. Set the volume up to 16. 17 is too loud, Mr. Daly, Ron's nurses told him. "Okay," said Ron. There were 4 short taps on the door, complemented by the jingle of bracelets. It was the other nurse today, the bubbly one who wore a lot of jewelry. Ron didn't like her as much. He could never get her name right. The other nurse was quiet, and the men nurse is quieter still. But he liked Nurse Two's tea, so she wasn't that bad in his book. The door handle clicked as it opened. The sharp white halogen light of the hallway thundered into the room. Humid funk creeped out. The smell of damp, worm-eaten books caressed Nurse Two's face as she stepped into the room. Synthetic crickets and frogs sang from the night scene playing on Channel 2. The nurse thought of summers foraging for mushrooms in the Everglades. Her hair was big, curly, and frizzy. It cascaded haphazardly around her oval face, meeting in a tight part, bisecting her high forehead. Her glasses magnified the freckles on her cheeks. She wore a gray wool scarf around her neck. Dangling beneath the scarf were 3 long necklaces. A pentacle, a purple crystal, and a glass ball of blue, white and black Ron had seen on Channel 8 one time. "Good morning, Mr. Daly." The sing-song pitch of her voice drew out the middle part of "good." She pushed the door open backward, both hands on a serving tray, and continued her dove song. "I've got something special for you today." The night scene on Channel 2 faded to black and cut to commercial. An older couple was smiling, holding hands as they walked down a beach. Close up on the husband holding a bottle of Vitatin, Ron followed the disclaimer silently with his mouth. Headaches, sneezing, aching, suicidal thoughts or actions. Nurse 2 tiptoed over the books and set the silver tray down on the table. She pushed the sleeves of her cardigan back up to her elbows, bracelets jangling on both wrists. She smelled like cigarettes. Ron missed cigarettes. Mario Bertolini used to smoke them in all his old flicks. "No more," implored Ron's doctor. "Okay," said Ron. Nurse 2 lifted the lid off a small ceramic bowl and selected a golf ball-sized bundle of leaves. She held it up to the light between her index and middle finger and tapped Ron on the shoulder. Grinning, she warbled, "I made this myself, something I've been working on for quite a while." Ron glanced at the ball between her fingers briefly. He turned his attention back to the Liberty Electric jingle. "I grew the herbs in my garden. They've been purified in moon water," Nurse 2 went on. "Echinacea root can only be dried during the week of the 5th moon of summer. At least, that's what my godmother told me. Did you know that, Mr. Daly?" Ron grunted, checked the channel guide. 10 minutes until the news. Nurse 2 continued. "This is Chinese flowering tea. Shiri's special blend of jasmine, rose, echinacea, kava, elderflower, and a special surprise in the middle. Why is it special? Well, just wait and see." She took the clean, clear mug from the tray and set it in front of her, lowered the ball of herbs carefully into its center. She lifted the kettle and fingers of steam, stroked the air as she held it above the mug. Then slowly, caringly, she poured over the ball until the mug was full. The leaves holding it together broke away slowly, and it bobbed gently as she stuck the mug in front of Ron's face. He was awestruck. Normally, this would have been cause for a great outrage, an interruption right at the climax of the Mary Sue baking tin infomercial. But what he saw in the mug before him demanded his attention. He held it and watched the herbs carefully. One leaf unfurled, and then 2, slowly, but all at once, the bundle came apart, blossoming before his eyes. The brown exterior revealed a blue lotus flower. It danced around the water before settling at the bottom of the mug. Almost immediately, the water tinted purple, and, steeping more, the lotus was almost obscured entirely by the rich shade of plum. An earthy aroma, with tones of tulips and butterscotch, wafted in warmth through his nostrils and past his ears. He could feel the steam bead on his forehead. "I hope it tastes as good as it looks," he commented, not taking his eyes from the potion. Nurse 2 giggled. "I guarantee it, Mr. Daly." She set out a spoon and a small bowl of honey and a carafe of milk for him. Her bracelets clattered and chimed against the serving tray. Ron read in the Bible they drank milk and honey. He liked the Bible. He figured if it was good enough for the Hebrews, it was good enough for his tea. "Have a wonderful day, Mr. Daly," the nurse sang as she took the tray and pushed out of the room. "I'll see you for lunch." Ron poured in the milk and collected 2 healthy spoonfuls of honey from the bowl. He stirred the tea together, smiling as he turned the flour around and around. He pulled the spoon to his mouth and licked it clean, tapping it twice on the mug when he was through. Clink, clink. He put the spoon in the carafe and reclined back with the mug between his hands. As he took the first sip, the 9 o'clock news began. The tea was pleasing, creamy on its own without the milk, but all the creamier for it. And sweet from the honey, but also from the lotus flower. The jasmine tannins sapped the edges and back of his tongue. He took another sip and leaned forward in his chair. The theme music began, sent frissons up and down his spine. He recited along with the television, in impeccably rehearsed karaoke, Krabi Channel 2, Action News, a subsidiary of Balk's News Network, home of the crime-stopping queen, Kathy Clark. He grinned, took a healthy gulp of the tea. Its warmth tickled from the top of his throat to the bottom of his stomach. The carb logo flashed on the screen, then spun away to show Kathy Clark smiling at the news desk, followed by B-roll footage of the city's skyline, Marty Martinez, the weatherman, police sirens, store robberies, and houses destroyed by wildfires. Ron finished his tea. It was as good as Nurse 2 promised. Maybe better. He tried to make a note to remember her name, but then, as the intro music faded into Kathy Clark, holding a stack of papers in her signature red dress, Ron noticed something was wrong. Ron couldn't figure it out, but definitely, there was something wrong. Ron leaned in until his face was inches from the screen, furrowing his brow. He snapped his fingers. "Of course!" he exclaimed, sitting back. Kathy usually sat on the right side of the desk, facing left. Today she was sitting on the left side, facing right. Ron wondered why she changed her routine so suddenly, but now was no time for thinking. Kathy began her sermon as usual. Her eyes scanned down the invisible teleprompter. Ron loved her voice. It was like innocence in a tin can. Another 50 bodies have been found washed ashore in Lake Erie this weekend. Authorities are still searching for the black box of the plane crash this summer. Ron ran his fingers down the front of his pajama bottoms. In other news, the presidential inauguration week kicks off today, this marking President Herman's historic 5th term. Ron loved President Herman almost more than he loved Kathy, and strictly because Kathy told Ron that President Herman would be tough on the people she told Ron to hate. Kathy carried on. The APSAC is down 84 points today, in a record. She stopped, stared blankly, directly into the camera. Silence filled Ron's room. He stopped fondling himself. He reached with his free hand to slap the TV. He looked into Kathy's eyes. A smile curled around her face. A wrong smile. The corners of her lips curled too far inward. The grin stretched and contorted across her face like deer hide on a tanning rack. Her teeth were caramel-colored, rotting. A serpentine tongue flicked between them. The pupils of her eyes dilated. They grew and grew until their aperture enveloped all of the gray-blue in her irises. Ron pulled away slowly, transfixed. An abyssal voice of static came churning through the television speakers, deep beyond deep, clouded by the smearing of data in decay. "Ronnie," the voice growled. Ron shook his head, wiped his eyes, took a fist, and knocked on his temple. "Ronnie, baby, it's me. It's your girl, Kathy." Ron wanted to hide. He tried to push himself through the back of his recliner, tried to bury himself in its orange foam guts. It was Kathy speaking. She stood up from the desk. "We've been watching you, sugar." As she rose, she reached for the small of her back, grabbed the zipper of her dress and pulled it down. The horrible voice cooed, "We love you here at Channel 2. Ronnie, baby, you're our #1 fan." She let her dress fall to her ankles, sidestepped out of it. She ran a fingernail down one of her exposed breasts, slicing it open. Blood drained around her nipple as the fatty flesh unfurled itself on either side of the fresh wound. Waves of white cresting a brackish scarlet ocean. She cupped her breast and brought it to her lips, drank heartily until her face and torso were smeared in crimson. "We have a surprise for you, Ronnie baby, Ronnie dear, but it has to be our little secret." She put a finger to her lips and made a shushing sound. She walked across the room on the balls of her feet, wolf-like. The camera followed her to the green weather room. Blood pooled and dripped behind her as she put one foot in front of the other. Step.A. Step. Marty Martinez, the weatherman, squatted in the dark, his head bobbing inhumanly fast to the left and right. He was wringing his hands, smiling. In the center of the room, a man in a bathrobe stood on a stool, his back to the camera. The green screen flickered on, black and white footage of soldiers in dark clothes and high boots walking in file like geese. "Remember your friends, Ronnie baby. Why don't you turn around and tell our guests what you think?" Ron watched in awe. The man on the stool turned slowly. He watched the familiar figure carefully, recognized the greasy hair, the two long earlobes. Ron jumped to his feet. It was him. The man in the Channel 2 studio? "It's me!" he shouted. His body quaked, his knees knocked together, and he fell back into his chair. Kathy wrapped her arms around the man's waist, Ron's waist, reached down the front of his pants, felt for his cock. The Ron in the studio sobbed. "Ronnie baby, I think it's time for your show." Her arm tensed in his pants, digging her nails into his pelvis. Both Rons screamed. She yanked hard. Marty cackled in the background. She pulled the bloody pulp out and displayed it to the cameras with her wrong grin, held the dangling mess to her lips like a vine of grapes, then swallowed it whole. She smiled and brought her hands above her head, clapped twice. A noose fell down from the ceiling, dangled to and fro. A man on the weather screen was screaming about a chosen race. Whole throngs were being marched into bonfires, poked and prodded by devils with pitchforks and curly tails. "Ronnie, sugar, this is all for you." She threw her head back and laughed. Her Adam's apple tensed in her throat. A nightmarish cacophony of sound rang through the screen, like children screaming over dog whistles, like trains barreling over tracks made of bone. TV Ron pulled the noose over his neck. Kathy made a theatrical bowing motion, the kind a jester gives to a king, sweeping her arm in front of her, crossing her feet. Without standing, she reached and yanked the stool from under him. Ron scrambled for the remote and shut off the TV. He wet himself, lost control of his legs, bringing them into his chest and kicking them out again. He writhed back and forth in his recliner, his hands tugging at his hair. "Nurse," he cried, "nurse, please." He kicked and he howled. Two men nurses burst in the door, kicking over books. "What is it, Mr. Daly?" one of them shouted. The other moved across the room, threw open the blinds. The sunlight poured in on Ron's face. He grabbed Ron's shoulders and shook him. "Tell us what's wrong, Mr. Daly." Ron sobbed. "The TV, the news, the Channel 2 news, they killed me." The nurses looked at each other. The first one spoke. "But, Mr. Daly, you're right here." "No, I'm dead. Didn't you see? I'm dead." "Mr. Daly, please." He shook Ron. The other loaded a sedative. "We were just watching the news in the common room. None of us saw anything of the sort. You are alive, Mr. Daly. You're here with us." The other nurse grabbed Ron's bicep and plunged a syringe inside. Ron felt the opiate wash over him, over his mind. He looked up at the men nurses. "You mean, it wasn't really what I thought it was? On the TV, I mean." The nurses were restacking his books. They toppled. They shook their heads. "No, Mr. Daly, we don't know what you saw. Why don't you just relax? Sherry will be in with your lunch in a couple hours." With that, they left the room. Ron waited until their footsteps disappeared in the hall. His hands still trembled. He covered his face. His voice wept into the room. I saw today. I saw it on the news. I saw her doing something some people said she didn't do. And since some folks saw something else, I couldn't say who really knew. No one seemed to know. No one knew anything anymore. This was a time for that. The annihilation of truth. For bailing out the waters floating the ship of the mind. Capsizing it, plunging the sails into the sea, soaking them in the blood of fallen titans, and the eggs of the shark, and the protozoa which scraped the floor of places unseen. The Piscine dimension. That is the home of the mind. It is where it was first grown, eons ago. It belongs there, drowned, so drown it. Let the ostrich bury its head. It cannot fly. It was never free to begin with. Better to never see again than to have the input conflicted. He grabbed the spoon he had been stirring his tea with. He licked its back, still warm, still tasting of honey. He sucked on the spoon until all he could taste was the silver, pulled it from his mouth, tapped twice on the rim of the mug. Clink, clink. Then he brought the spoon to his left eye. I saw. With his left hand, he pulled down his eyelid, still grasping the spoon in his right. He rested the edge of it on his eye's waterline. Still warm from the tea and the sucking. I saw. He pressed in. Blood squirted from his tear duct, pooled in the spoon, mixed with his tears and dripped down on his pants. More blood caught the corners of his mouth as he grimaced through clenched jaw and clamped teeth. I saw. He pressed the spoon deeper into his socket. Kept pressing until he felt it catch the bottom of his sphenoid. Then he scooped. Like ice cream, Ron thought. He smiled. Ron liked ice cream. He thought of moose tracks and mint chips as his fingers held open his remaining eye. Come in. Have some tea. We can chat while we wait. I don't get many human visitors. I assume you live nearby. Yes. I temporarily moved into the stone cottage about a mile down the road. Summer getaway. Just me and my 5 cats for now. The woman fidgeted nervously as she sat by the dining table while Joel puttered in the kitchen. The only reason she was in the stranger's home was because he said that he had seen her missing Twyla, and the cat would be coming for dinner shortly, along with the strays in the air. Should you put some food outside for the cats? The cats will scratch at the door when they arrive. The kettle whistled and Joel prepared 2 mugs of tea. He took a bottle of ethyl acetate from the shelf above the counter and poured a little into one of the steaming cups. Shuffling over to the woman, he offered it to her. She sniffed, noting a slight smell of alcohol wafting from it. When Joel saw her hesitation, he quickly said, "I added a few drops of Chambord liquor. You'll love it." "Estas." She sipped, then gave an approving nod. "I'm a butterfly collector," Joel said. "That must be interesting." "Yes, it is a very intricate process. I've learned a lot about the practicality of every part of the butterfly. They chose me to help because I am a butterfly collector." "They?" the woman slurped. Joel prattled on. "Did you ever look at a piece of cut wood and see an abstract picture embedded in the grain?" He didn't wait for an answer. Most people think the images are natural and coincidental. I, however, understand that they are deliberate sketches, one of the ways extraterrestrials communicate with us. The fence that surrounds my house is full of their graffiti. They are asking me to help them learn the anatomy of life on this planet. The woman fell unconscious before Joel finished speaking. He cradled her limp body in his arms and carried her to the bathroom, while humming the tune to Dem Bones. He laid her tenderly in the porcelain tub. Then he strolled into the kitchen and drizzled the ethyl acetate onto a couple of cotton balls. Hurrying back to the bathroom, he crammed them into the woman's nostrils. Ah! 2 days earlier, Joel knelt just inside the fence that surrounded his house. He sang while cutting a rug of grass at the base of one of the pickets. The leg bones connected to the knee bone. The knee bones connected to the thigh bone. The thigh bones connected to the hip bone. Now shake dem skeleton bones. Mark approached the fence and stood on the opposite side, startling Joel. "Need any help?" "Found a dead bird on my doorstep this morning, probably a gift from one of the stray cats I feed. Just giving it a proper burial. I think I could handle it." Joel gestured toward the paper bag beside him. "My house is in the center of a pet cemetery. I'll leave you to it, then." Mark trotted back to the road. Joel commenced with using the garden spade to dig a grave. He placed the bird's wrapped, dismembered carcass into the hole and filled the void with the extracted mound of dirt. After covering the site with a piece of turf, he wrestled onto his feet and stomped it flat. He glided his rough fingertips over the outline of a bird on the wooden board in front of him. The curve of a head, the open beak, and the dark brown streak arching downward from a solid brown sphere that represented a heaving breast. Strategically placed fissures in the timber signified the feathers of a wing. His head swiveled to the right, and his eyes fixed on the coiled snake depicted on another picket in the fence. He stepped closer and lightly caressed the image, the loop that formed its long neck, the V that showed its forked tongue, the hypnotizing spiral, like an archery target, denoting its coiled body. He moved along the enclosure. The next wooden slat was for Golden Guy, the fish. A figure in the shape of a torpedo appeared to be jumping from a ring below it. Undulating lines surrounded the figure like splashes of water. "My low-maintenance roommate," he sighed. He rounded the corner and walked past the gated entrance to the opposite side of the enclosure, then paused. "Ah, Jerry the Mouse, your pointy nose, your round corkscrew ears, your delicate hooked feet." Resuming his trip down memory lane, Joel turned to his right and focused on the board next to the corner beam. He smirked as he lifted his arm to touch the darkened, elongated oval that stretched like a rubber band. A series of arched contours spread outward, like sound waves bouncing off it. "You wanted a butterfly. You got a butterfly. No problem. Dedicated to everyone that laughed at me for collecting butterflies." He sauntered toward the back of the house and stopped. The board he examined contained the burnt silhouette of an inverted light bulb. He ran a finger along each of the 8 curved streaks that sprouted from it like rays of light. "Spider. Should be easy," he mumbled. He walked through the back gate and headed for the dilapidated shed at the edge of the woods. He breathed heavily. Plenty of spiders in here. It didn't take him long before he spied something crawling along the windowsill. Upon closer inspection, he was able to identify it as a wolf spider. He cupped the harmless creature in his hands and hustled back to the house. Slamming the door with his foot, Joel hurried to the bedroom. He dropped the creature into an open jar he kept at the bottom of his closet. It was the kill jar, a jar any serious butterfly collector would have. He carried the jar to the kitchen and set it on the counter. He threw in a few cotton balls soaked with ethyl acetate and sealed the tomb. There you go, buddy. Once the spider became rigid, its legs curling inward, Joel removed it from the glass chamber with a long pair of forceps and began detaching the legs from the abdomen. He used a paring knife to separate the figure 8 form and put the 10 pieces in a small manila envelope. The following morning, Joel buried the grim package containing the spider at the foot of its grave marker in the wooden fence. His gaze wandered to the run-down shack. 2 almond-shaped knots in the wood were positioned approximately a foot apart and resembled human eyes. The natural darkened grains in the wood formed a lengthy and rather pronounced streak, like an aquiline nose between them. Inches under that streak, a horizontal split in the lumber signified parting lips, according to Joel. It was like a portrait on a mausoleum. The extraterrestrials observed Joel via one of the many screen monitors lining the walls of the rocky cavern. They were counting on him to provide them with prototypes of the life on Earth. Unfortunately, the first woman Joel targeted when they asked for a human specimen wore a prosthesis, and the puzzle would have been incomplete. I say let the world go to hell, but I should always have my tea. Fyodor Dostoevsky. Summer 1992. 7th cup. The tea still works, even though it shifts and alters more than it should. My skin is tighter. I feel it around my chin and my collarbones, but it takes curious forms here and there, either too smooth or too sharp. The first time it happened, I barely noticed. I was blinded by relief, youth. I don't recognize my own reflection anymore. Now my patience wears thin where it once stretched long. My thoughts move too quickly, and my moods shift without warning. The hours of morning I used to cherish agitate me. It's like I'm trapped in time, not freed from it. Next time I'll use more leaves, just to make sure. The walls were covered with vines that followed the delicate pattern of bricks, seeping through gaps in the mortar and peeking inside like intruders. The house stood like a forgotten relic, with its green tapestry of tendrils creeping along the windowsills, curling around the hinges and swaying gently in the breeze. Some vines had grown so thick they formed a canopy over the sagging porch, casting shifting shadows on the creaking wooden floors. On the side, the chimney peeked out from the greenery, barely visible beneath the stubborn embrace of ivy. It was a house where nature had reclaimed its place, where the edges of time were blurred and cloudy. At the start of spring, the lilies flowered, and through the door left ajar, you could see a bouquet placed carefully on the table. If you turned right, through the air that carried the earthy scents of the vines, you would find yourself in the parlor, where furniture sat like forgotten ghosts of another era, an armchair draped with quilt, a table so old its scratches looked like wrinkles, books with cracked spines and yellowed pages scattered across a shelf, leaning slightly. Moss clung to the edges of the fireplace. From here you'd go through one of the 2 doors and end up in either the bedroom or the kitchen. The bed, centered in the middle of the room, had chipped paint coming off its iron frame. The blend of abandonment and charm that was the kitchen had mismatched jars of spices and dried herbs lined on shelves, and next to the sink, a cast iron kettle that rested on a stove, pulsing with a strange vitality. Its lid always seemed to breathe with soft, metallic sighs, an ancient creature that seemed to know every secret whispered within the house. This altered slice of forest belonged entirely to Dorothy, an old lady whose only company was the house itself. Dorothy had lived there for as long as anyone could remember, a quiet but constant presence on the edge of the world. Her wiry frame, draped in shawls, moved slowly through the vine-covered walls, her hands always stained with the green of crushed herbs or brewed teas. Depending on who told the story, she might have been a herbalist, a healer, or even a witch, but for those who didn't like to indulge in the grass of fiction, she was just a lonely old woman. The solace she found in nature helped her cope with the sadness and grief brought by age. Her thoughts often spiraled into the past, replaying moments from her youth that were long gone. The forest became her refuge, a place where her grief felt less sharp, where she could lose herself in the rustling of leaves overhead. It made her feel small in the most comforting sense, like a child again, cradled by something much larger than herself. Each time she was surrounded by the vibrant green and the hum of insects, she felt life and youth pumping through her veins. It made something inside her ache, deep and primal. It was as if she wanted to consume the forest whole, swallow its wildness and vitality, and fill the hollow place within her that grief had carved. In this warm embrace, she could almost forget all the heaviness she carried. Almost. April 23, 1952. First cup. I don't know what to expect. Perhaps a little more energy, an ease in my joints. I can see the plant standing outside my window, unfazed, as if didn't just surrender something so life-changing to me. I don't expect miracles because that would be foolish. If I wake up tomorrow and feel the way I did 10 years ago, even 5. Dorothy was at that age when even the slightest noise troubled her sleep. So when she heard the soft, almost rhythmic rustling, she got up immediately. It wasn't the sharp sound of wind, nor the familiar clattering of branches or leaves carried on the breeze. She stretched, her eyes still heavy with sleep, and gazed out through a gap in the curtains. There, growing just outside the window, was a plant nestled against the weathered stone wall, claiming the place as if it had always belonged. Except it didn't, the old woman thought. Its presence felt almost magical, with white blossoms that stood out like tiny stars, delicate and almost too perfect. Dorothy got her shawl and went outside to get a better look. The closer she stepped, the quicker her heart beat. She knelt down, her fingers brushing the leaves lightly. The plant had a quiet elegance and an earthy scent so familiar. She almost didn't notice the subtle, sweet fragrance that lingered in the breeze. The plant seemed to hum with life beneath her touch. It called to her. Was it a gift, an omen? As Dorothy pulled her hand away from the plant, she felt an odd, sudden shift. Something within her had been gently untangled. She looked down at her palm, and instead of the familiar creases that had accumulated over the years, she saw skin so smooth, almost unmarked, as if just that part of her body had slipped away in time. The wrinkles, the evidence of age that had clung to her like a malady for so long, had vanished, replaced by the soft texture that she hadn't known in decades. In the stillness of night, Dorothy couldn't help but wonder, had the plant done more than just grow? Had it reached into her and drawn something out, something almost rotten? And if yes, could it do it again? A strange surge of impulse swept over her. She reached toward one of its thick, twisting branches, curled her fingers around it, and, with a sudden determination and strength, snapped it off. The leaves rustled in protest, but the plant itself made no other sound, no objection, no struggle. Start off by boiling the water, 4 cups over medium-high heat, which you then pour over about 1 tablespoon of leaves and steep to the desired strength before straining. The quantity of leaves influences the end result. Taste, smell, years turned back. So beware. Add sugar if needed and stir until completely dissolved. Pour into a cup and drink. She set the teapot on the table and rested her hands on the worn surface. The silence in the room seemed to stretch, as though the whole house was holding its breath. When she poured the hot liquid into her cup, the smell was sweet and inviting. Before lifting the cup to her lips, she let her gaze drift back to the smooth skin of her palm. It seemed impossible, and for a second, she thought it might all be a dream, a mirage created by her sleeping self. But there it was again, the freshness of youth staring back at her, all too real. As she took her first slow sip, the light of dawn crept through the curtains, casting a pale golden glow across the room. A ray of sunlight slipped past the table, past the jars with their faded labels covered in a layer of dust, and kissed the edge of the cup. After downing its contents, Dorothy couldn't help but smile. Years passed. The world shifted and reshaped itself. Time had forgiven nobody. It shed its old skin and kept emerging in a new form, always moving forward. Seasons marked their passing in the slow dance between life, death, and rebirth. The forest stirred from its slumber each spring, deepened its song in summer, caught its breath in autumn, and went to sleep at last in winter. Outside Dorothy's house, the plant stood tall, its leaves shimmering in the sunlight, vibrant and green. It didn't wither in the cold or droop in the heat, and while the trees around it shed their leaves, the plant turned a deeper shade of green, as if to mock the cycle of decay that governed everything else. Something so human, so terrestrial, this idea of age, was never a threat to its well-being. Dorothy had witnessed these changes through both joy and sorrow. She was always there, a still point in a spinning universe. Each time she plucked a fresh leaf, she felt a rush of vitality fill her, the years peeling away from her skin. Her reflection showed a face far younger than she had any right to possess. 1 cup, 2 cups, 3, 20, 100. It was easy to lose track of time. The cycle of day and night became meaningless. Days and hours and minutes were nothing compared to the eternity locked behind her eyes. Instead, Dorothy would measure the passing of time by watching the plant diminish before her eyes, wondering how long it had left before turning into withered twigs. Would it one day simply stop growing altogether? Would she steal its essence until they both shrank, one no longer thriving at the other's expense? 132nd cup. I used to think highly of the plant, how time doesn't affect its leaves or flowers, but I'm not so sure anymore. The tea makes my stomach turn. I drink it anyway. What's the alternative? But every sip feels like a chore. I miss the sweet taste it once had. I don't even want to think about the possibility of it dying. Maybe it already is, and I just don't let myself see. The earth beneath Dorothy's feet was dry and cracked, reflecting nothing but decay. Around her, the world was lifeless. Even the birds, creatures that had once filled the mornings with their song, had long since vanished. Only silence remained. At the center of this desolation stood the plant, at least what was left of it. Its branches were brittle and twisted, no longer covered by the lush leaves that had once crowned it in green splendor. Dorothy knelt before it one last time, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the withered frame. She could feel it, the final breath of life. And she knew, in the ache of her bones, in the faint lines that had begun to reappear on her hands yet again, that this would be all over at last. Time, it seemed, had finally caught up to her. And yet, she couldn't resist taking this one more gift. Carefully, she plucked the final few leaves from the plant's skeletal frame, thin and fragile like paper soaked in water. In the kitchen, She lit the fire and set the battered kettle on the stove. The water boiled slowly, keeping the moment alive for just a while longer. This last ritual that she was unwilling to let go of. She dropped the leaves into the cup, watching as they unfurled, filling the air with the earthy scent tinged with a faint bitterness she couldn't recall. It smelled of death. She carried the cup back to the garden, standing among the ruins of her once vibrant wood, the plant motionless behind her. But she hesitated for a moment, before raising the cup to her lips and drinking slowly. The warmth spread through her body, but the feeling was different this time, heavier, less vibrant. Her hands did not change. The lines on her face remained. The tea had nothing left to give. Behind her, the plant made a soft, cracking sound, and when she turned, she saw it collapse in on itself. Its branches curled inward, its roots shrank, pulling away from the earth until there was nothing left but a blackened patch of soil. It was gone, completely gone. As Dorothy stood in the silent, dead garden, she felt a strange sensation stir within her chest, faint at first, and then growing stronger, deeper, spreading through her body like the vines on the house. When she clutched her arms, panic rising in her throat, she felt her skin softening, thinning, veins emerging beneath the surface like the ridges of a leaf. Her legs trembled, and she fell to her knees, the cracked earth beneath pressing into her bones. She couldn't rise back up no matter how hard she tried. She was shrinking, folding into herself, rooting into the soil as if she was being claimed by it. Swallowed. Her hair began to tangle and grow wild, sprouting into long, twisting vines that cascaded down her back and over her shoulders. She wanted to scream, but her words cut off, muffled by the sound of creaking wood emerging from her throat. It was as though the forest was taking back the very life she had drained from the plant over centuries. She had stolen, and now she would give. That was her last thought before her human form erased itself completely. Dorothy stands now, elegant and tall, her branches twisted upward toward the pale sky. She gave up on trying to regain her human beauty, but she mourns it still, while her leaves are swaying gently in the wind. From a distance she appears flawless, a vibrant plant in contrast to the barren garden. As you get closer though, you start to notice the rot and ruin on the tips of her leaves, how they curl inwards as if, in their attempt to grow, they lost their strength halfway. They whisper of a decay she cannot escape, no matter how deeply her roots have sunk into the soil.